In reality, neither this world which we imagine we experience through our five senses, nor God, who regulates exactly what we experience in this world, are separate from us, that is, from our real self. However, because we have separated ourselves as a finite mind or individual consciousness, the world and God both appear to be separate from us. Therefore, the root cause of seeming separation or division that we experience ourselves, the world and God, is our basic imagination that we are a separate individual consciousness. In a state devoid of form, there can be no separation. So we are able to separate ourselves only by imagining ourselves to be a form, because we imagine ourselves to be a distinct form. Other forms that are separate from us also appear to exist. The basic form that we imagine to be ourself is our physical body. But by imagining ourselves to be this body, we also give rise to a more subtle form, namely our mind, which is the individual consciousness that feels, I am this body, and we thereby feel ourselves to be this more subtle form also. Thus, the form that distinguishes us as an individual is a compound form consisting of the physical form of this body and the subtle form of this mind. By imagining this compound form to be ourself, we seemingly divide or separate ourselves from our own absolute reality, our formless, infinite, and indivisible real self, and having separated ourselves thus, we experience our own self as two other basic entities, namely the world and God. Because we imagine the world and God to be separate from us, we imagine them to be forms like us. Therefore, in verse 4 of Uladu Narpadu, Sri Ramana says, if we are a form, the world and God will be likewise. If we are not a form, who could see their forms, and how? Can the sight, whatever is seen, be otherwise than the I, the consciousness that sees it? We, that I, the formless consciousness I am, are the limitless I, the infinite consciousness. The form in which this world exists in our imagination is a physical form like our physical body, and the form in which God exists in our imagination is a more subtle form like our mind. Just as we cannot see our mind as a physical entity, we cannot see God as a physical entity, but that does not mean that he does not have a form. Though we cannot see his form in the same manner that we see the physical form of this world, he is not for that reason any less real than this world. Just as our mind is the soul that animates the physical form of our body, so God is the soul that animates the physical form of this entire world. We cannot see the mind in the physical body of another person, but from the behavior of that physical body, we are able to infer that a mind is present within it. Likewise, we are able to infer the presence of God in this world, even though we cannot see him. Just as our mind is a subtle and intangible form, a form that we experience as our first thought I, so God is also a subtle and intangible form, a form that we can experience only as a thought, a concept, a belief, or a mental image. However, just because the form of God as we know him is only a thought or mental image, this does not mean that he is unreal. As a form or separate being, God is as real as this world and as our individual self. Even the physical forms of our body and of this entire world are actually only thoughts or mental images, but that does not mean that they are unreal. Our individual self, the world and God are all thoughts, and as such they are real, but only relatively real. As separate entities, none of them is the absolute reality, but they are each a relative reality. The world and God are both as real as our mind, our individual consciousness which experiences them both as mental images. as distinct mental images, not only the world and God, but even our own individual self or mind, exist only in our imagination. As soon as we imagine ourselves to be a separate individual, the world and God also come into existence as separate entities. The reality of each one of these three basic entities is inseparable from the reality of the other two. Though all three of them are imaginary, so long as we experience the existence of ourself as an individual, we will also experience the existence of the world and God. As Sri Ramana says in the 7th paragraph of Nanyar, which we discussed in the previous chapter, that which actually exists is only Atmasvarupa, our own essential self. The world, soul, and God are Palkanegal, imaginations, mental creations, or fabrications. In it, our essential self, like the imaginary silver that we see in a shell. These three basic elements of relativity or duality appear at the same time and disappear at the same time. Our Svarupa, our own form or essential self, alone is the world. Our Svarupa alone is I, our mind or individual self. Our Svarupa alone is God. Everything is Shiva Swarupa, our essential self, which is Shiva, the absolute and only truly existing reality. Therefore, though God as a separate entity is only a figment of our own imagination, he is nevertheless as real as this world and also as real as our mind, which imagines him to be separate from itself. So long as we experience our mind as if it were real, we cannot deny the relative reality of God. Since he is the infinitely subtle power that regulates everything that we experience in this or any other world, he is as real as anything else that we experience. As we saw above, the function of God is to regulate or govern this world and all the individuals in it. His overall function of governing everything in this universe includes many aspects or sub-functions, including various material functions, such as ensuring that all the physical objects in this universe obey the various laws of nature, the laws of mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. However, his most important and significant function is his most subtle one, which is to bestow his grace, or blessing, upon all us individual souls in such a manner as to guide us towards and along the path that leads to salvation or true self-knowledge. This function of bestowing grace includes ordaining the time, the place, and the manner in which each of the fruits or consequences of all our past actions should be experienced by us. We generate these fruits by thought, word, and deed. That is, by using our free will to perform karmas or actions through our mind, speech, and body. All these actions that we thus perform by our free will are driven by the force of our desires. When our desires are strong and we do not keep them in check, they rage wildly as thoughts in our mind and impel us to speak and act rashly, selfishly, and without concern for the effects that our words and actions will have upon others. Such selfishly motivated thoughts, speech, and actions are bad karmas, or sins, and by such sins we generate bad fruits, which we will later have to experience as some form of suffering or pain. When we keep a check on our desires and shape them with due concern for other people and creatures, we will think, speak, and act more carefully and with greater compassion, not wishing to cause any harm to any other living being. Such actions of mind, speech, and body that we perform with due care and true compassion are good karmas, by which we generate good fruits, which we will later have to experience as some form of pleasure. Good desires lead to good actions, which in turn yield good fruit, while bad desires lead to bad actions, which in turn yield bad fruit. The rate at which we generate fruit is determined by the strength of our desires, whether they are good desires or bad desires, or, as is usually the case, a mixture of both. If our desires are strong, they will generate fruit rapidly. We can avoid generating fresh fruit only by surrendering our will to God. That is, by giving up all our desires, both good and bad. However, because our desires are generally very strong, we usually generate fresh fruit at a much greater rate than we are able to experience them. Thus, in each single lifetime, we generate far more fruit than we could possibly experience in a single lifetime. So during the course of many lifetimes, we have each accumulated a vast store of fruits that we are yet to experience. Even if our desires are now greatly reduced due to our efforts to surrender our own will and to yield ourselves to the will of God, we will still have a vast stock of fruits that we have accumulated as a result of our past desires. From the vast store of the fruits of our past actions that we have not yet experienced, God is able to select carefully those fruits that will be most beneficial for us to experience now, and He therefore ordains that those fruits should be experienced by us as our destiny or fate in this present lifetime. The fruits that He destines us to experience now are those that will be most conducive to the development of our spiritual maturity, that is, to enkindling in our mind the clarity of discrimination that will enable us to free ourselves from our desires, fears, and attachments, and to develop the true love just to be. Since everything that we experience is our destiny, and since our destiny is those fruits of our past actions that for our own greatest good God has carefully selected and ordained for us to experience now, whatever we happen to experience is truly the will of God. All the divine qualities of God that are described by our various religions are true. Most importantly, He is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful. Because He is omniscient, or all-knowing, nothing can happen in this world that He does not know. Because He is omnipotent, or all-powerful, nothing can happen in this world without His consent. And because He is all-loving, or rather because He is love itself, nothing can happen in this world that is not for the ultimate good of all concerned. All this is true, but only as true as our existence as a separate individual consciousness. If we are real as a separate individual, then the God and all His divine qualities are also real. In other words, until we attain true self-knowledge and thereby merge in our own real self, losing our separate individuality, God will exist as a separate, all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful being, and He will always be guiding and assisting us in our efforts to know ourself. However, when we do finally know our real self, and thereby become free from the delusion that we are a separate individual, God will also cease to exist as a separate being, and will instead be experienced by us as our own real self. As a separate being, God is real, but only relatively real. So long as we imagine Him to be separate from us, He cannot as such be the absolute reality, which is infinite and therefore separate from nothing. However, His separation from us is real only in the limited and distorted view of our mind. In His real nature or essential being, God is always one with our own essential being. So when we experience our essential being as it really is, we will discover that God is our own real self, and that as such He is the absolute reality. So long as we feel ourselves to be a person, a distinct and finite individual, we have a tendency to consider God to be some sort of person. Not a limited person like ourselves, but somehow a person nonetheless. We believe God to be infinite, yet we nevertheless consider Him to be a person. How can we reconcile this obvious contradiction, and what is the actual basis of this almost universally held concept of God? How can God be both the infinite fullness of being and any sort of person, even if we consider that person to be the supreme person? If he is truly infinite, he cannot be a person of any sort whatsoever, because a person is by definition a finite individual, a distinct and separate being. What then are we to infer from the fact that we have this confused notion of an infinite yet personal God? Does this not indicate that none of our concepts of God are actually an adequate depiction of his true nature? Because in reality, he transcends all human conception. Is it true that God is infinite? It is true that God is infinite, but as such he cannot be separate either from ourself or from any other thing. Since he is the infinite fullness of being, he is the whole that includes all things within itself, and as such he is the essence of everything. However, so long as we do not experience his infinite being as our own real self, our own true essence, we mistake ourself to be a finite individual, and this mistaken view of ourself distorts our conception of the infinite reality that we call God, making us feel that he is somehow separate from us. Given the fact that we mistake ourselves to be somehow separate from the infinite reality that we call God, relative to this mistaken view both of ourself and of God, do we have any valid reason to consider God to be a person? Is our concept of a personal God even a remote approximation to the truth of his nature? Surprising though it may seem, our conception of God as a person does in fact have a reasonable and valid basis in reality. What is that basis? The ultimate reality of God is that he is our own real self, our essential being. As we have seen earlier, an intrinsic characteristic of ourself is that we love ourself and we love happiness, because happiness is our own true nature. When we remain as we really are, that is, as our pure self-conscious being, devoid of all doing and dualistic knowing, we experience perfect happiness, because our essential being, which is our adjunct-free, non-dual consciousness of being, is itself the infinite fullness of happiness. However, when we imagine ourselves to be a finite individual, we seemingly separate ourselves from the infinite happiness which is our own true being, and hence we become restless, hankering to experience once again that infinite happiness. Our love to be happy is inherent not only in us as an individual, but also in us as the infinite and non-dual consciousness of being. Love is, in fact, our true nature, our own essential being. We can never for a moment remain without love for happiness, because we are that love. Our true self-conscious and perfectly happy being is infinite love, because happiness and love are inseparable. We love whatever makes us happy, and we are made happy by experiencing whatever we love. The ultimate happiness lies in experiencing that which we love most, which is ourself, our own true self-conscious being. When we imagine ourselves to be a finite individual, we seemingly separate ourselves from God, who is in reality nothing other than our own true being, which is perfect peace and absolute happiness. Whether we know it or not, our love for happiness is love for God, because God is a name that we give to the infinite happiness that we all seek. Since God is in truth our own real self, he loves us as himself, and his only will or desire is that we should be perfectly happy. Because he loves each and every living being as himself, and because he therefore loves us all to be infinitely happy as he is, all religions teach the fundamental truth that God is love. Because we each feel ourselves to be a human being, we cannot avoid thinking of the love of God in anthropomorphic terms. Due to our deluded experience of ourself as an individual person, we mistake love to be something personal, and we are unable to conceive of a love that is impersonal, or rather transpersonal. Hence, though in reality the love of God transcends all forms of limitation, including the limitation that is inherent in the love of one person for another person, we are not entirely mistaken in considering God to be a person whose love is all-embracing. That is, from the limited standpoint of our human mind, the love that God has for each one of us does function in a manner that is very similar to the love between one person and another. The love that is the true nature of God, and that manifests in our view as a seemingly personal love for each one of us, is the basis of our belief in a personal God, though in reality he is not a person, but is the essential substance and infinite totality of all that is. From the finite standpoint of our human mind, he does in effect appear to act as a person who has unbounded love for each and every one of us. Therefore, though our belief in the seemingly personal nature of God may appear to be incompatible with the ultimate truth of his nature, namely, that he is the infinite, indivisible, non-dual, and absolute reality, which is our own true self or essential being, this superficial incompatibility is recognized by the fact that God is not only infinite being and consciousness, but is also infinite love. Because he is infinite being, and because there is therefore nothing that is separate from or other than him, he is indeed all-powerful or omnipotent. Because he is infinite consciousness or knowledge, being the ultimate foundation and essential substance of all forms of knowledge, he is indeed all-knowing or omniscient. And because he is infinite love, having unbounded love for everything as his own self, he is indeed all-loving. So long as we imagine ourselves to be a particular person, the almighty, all-knowing, and all-living infinite reality that we call God does appear to function as a person, and therefore we are able to experience an intensely personal love for him, even though we may understand the truth that he is the impersonal absolute reality. By cultivating such love for him in our heart, we can learn to surrender our self-deluded individual will to his divine will, which is the simple love just to be, and thereby we can attune ourselves to his true nature of non-dual, self-conscious being. The personal love that we feel for God is by no means a love that is one-sided on our part. In fact, if it is in any way one-sided, it is on his part and not ours, because his love for us is infinitely greater than our love for him. Therefore, when we cultivate sincere love for him, he responds in far greater measure, helping us to surrender ourselves entirely to him by drawing our mind inwards, thereby establishing it firmly in our fundamental consciousness of our own being, I am, which is his real nature. In truth, however, God does much more than just respond to the love that we feel for him, because he is actually responsible for enkindling such love in our heart. That is, since he is the ultimate source of all love, whatever love we feel for him originates only from him. Though we speak of our personal relationship with God in this apparently dualistic manner, the duality that seems to exist in the love between him and us actually exists only in the inherently dualistic outlook of our own mind, and not in the inherently non-dualistic outlook of his real being. Since he knows us and loves us as his own essential self, his love is in truth always perfectly non-dual, and therefore completely non-personal. Nevertheless, though the absolute truth is that his love for us is non-dual and non-personal, from the relative standpoint of our mind, the seemingly dualistic and personal nature of his love is quite real. That is, his personal love for us is every bit as real as our seeming existence as a separate individual person. So long as we mistake ourselves to be a person, the non-dual love that God has for us will appear to us to be a personal love, albeit a love that is infinite. Only when we respond to his infinite love, by surrendering our mind or separate individuality entirely to him, sacrificing it in the clarity of our own self-conscious being, which is his true essence, will we be able to experience the real, non-dual, and transpersonal nature of his love. Though in the limited and distorted view of our mind, God appears to perform certain functions, in reality he is just being, and hence he does not do anything. All the functions that he appears to perform happen due to his mere presence, without him actually doing anything. This fact is explained graphically by Sri Ramana in the 15th paragraph of Nanyar. Just as in the mere presence of the sun, which rose without iksha, wish, desire, or liking, samkalpa, volition or intention, or yatna, effort or exertion, a crystal stone or magnifying lens will emit fire, a lotus will blossom, water will evaporate, and people of the world will engage in or begin their respective activities, do those activities and subside or cease being active, and just as in front of a magnet, a needle will move, so jivas, living beings, who are caught in the finite state governed by muttozil, the threefold function of God, namely the creation, sustenance, and dissolution of the world, or panchakrityas, the five functions of God, namely creation, sustenance, dissolution, concealment, and grace, which happen due to nothing but the special nature of the presence of God. Move, busy themselves, perform activities, make effort or strive, and subside, cease being active, become still or sleep, in accordance with their respective karmas. That is, in accordance not only with their parabdha karma or destiny, which impels them to do whatever actions are necessary in order for them to experience all the pleasant and unpleasant things that they are destined to experience, but also with their karma vasanas, their inclinations or impulsions to desire, think, and act in particular ways, which impel them to make effort to experience certain pleasant things that they are not destined to experience, and to avoid certain unpleasant things that they are destined to experience. Nevertheless, he, God, is not samkalpa saritar, a person connected with or possessing volition or intention. Even one karma does not adhere to him. That is, he is not bound or affected by any karma or action whatsoever. That is, like world actions, the actions happening here on earth, not adhering or affecting the sun, and like the qualities and defects of the other four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, not adhering to the all-pervading space. Like the sun, whose mere presence causes so many things to happen on this earth, God has no iksha or samkalpa, desire or intention, and hence he never makes any yatna or effort to do anything. Yet his mere presence causes all living beings to act, each according to his or her own destiny and personal inclinations. Though all that happens due to his mere presence, he remains completely unaffected by anything that happens, either by any action or by its effects. He does not do anything, and he is not affected by anything that appears to be done, because he is pure being. Being is the single, non-dual, undivided, and infinite isness or essence of all that is, and as such, it just is. and never does anything. Whatever we or anything else may appear to do, our essential isness or being remains as it is. All karma, all action or doing is finite, and therefore relative and superficial. That which is infinite, absolute, and essential is our own being. All doing depends upon being, and it can happen only in the presence of being. Unless we are, we cannot do. But whatever we do does not in any way affect, change, or modify the fact that we are. Being, therefore, transcends all forms of doing. God is the infinitude or fullness of being. He is the isness or essence of all that is. Because he is the essence of everything, he is present everywhere, in all places and at all times. His all-pervading presence is therefore just his being, which is the essential being or isness of everything. Because he is the one infinite whole or fullness of being, nothing can exist apart from him, and hence he is present in everything as everything. Because he is everything, he is also said to be Mahakarta, the great doer, or Sarvakarta, the all-doer, the one who does everything, including the 5 fundamental actions or panchakrityas, namely Srishti, the creation or projection of this entire appearance of duality, which we call the world or universe, Stichti, the sustenance or maintenance of this appearance, Samhara, the dissolution or withdrawal of this appearance, Tirodhana or Tirubhava, the concealment or veiling of the reality, which not only enables Srishti, Sthiti, and Samhara to take place, but also more specifically enables living beings to continue to do karmas and to experience their consequences so long as they have desired to do so, and Anugraha, or grace, the revealing of the reality, which enables us to experience true self-knowledge, and thereby to transcend the unreal state of duality in which all these panchakrityas appear to happen. However, though in our limited outlook it appears that God does all these 5 actions or panchakrityas, he does not in fact do anything. He just is. And due to the mere presence of his isness or being, all these panchakrityas happen automatically and spontaneously. Therefore, if we wish to say that God does anything, that is true only in the sense that he does it all by just being. That is why Sri Ramana says that these panchakrityas all happen due to isan sannidhana visesha matra, which means nothing but the special nature of the presence of God. The fact that God is just the infinite fullness of being and therefore does not do anything is the ultimate and absolute truth. However, from the limited standpoint of our finite mind, the fact that he is separate from us and has certain functions to perform is relatively real. That is, so long as we feel ourselves to be a doer of action, it will appear to us that the functions of God are actions that he is actually doing. So long as any action is done, there has to be something or someone who is doing that action. So from our relative standpoint, we are correct in believing that God is the ultimate doer of everything. The fact that he is just being, and that due to his mere being or presence, all actions appear to be done, can be fully comprehended by us only when we experience ourselves as just being, and thereby discover that we have never done anything, and that all action or doing was a mere imagination that existed only in the distorted view of our unreal mind. All doing is merely a distortion of being. Though being is truly the only reality, and though it just is, in the limited and distorted view of our mind, it is experienced as doing. Though all doing is an unreal appearance, being a mere figment of our imagination, It could not even appear to be real if it were not supported by the underlying reality of being. Before we can imagine that we are doing anything, we must first know that we are. The imagination that we are doing appears and disappears, but the knowledge that we are endures. Since our being alone endures, it is the only permanent and absolute reality, and therefore the appearance of doing is an illusion that can occur only due to being, or rather, due to our mind's distorted view of being. Just as we are real in two very distinct senses, so God is real in the same two distinct senses. As a finite individual consciousness that imagines, I am this body, I am doing this or that, we are relatively real, but as the infinite consciousness I am, we are absolutely real. Likewise, as a separate all-doing, all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful being, God is relatively real. But as our own infinite consciousness I am, which is the limitless fullness of being, love, knowledge, and power, He is absolutely real. So long as God and ourself appear to be two separate beings, the world will also appear to exist. Relative to our individual self or mind, God and the world are both perfectly real. None of these three separate entities is any less real than the other two. We cannot experience either the world that we perceive or the God who governs it as unreal, so long as we experience our experiencing mind as real. Understanding theoretically that our mind, the world, and God are all unreal is necessary, but it is of practical value to us only to the extent that it enables us to develop true inward detachment from our mind and our entire life in this world, and true love to know and to be our own real self. If we believe that we have understood the world to be unreal, but we still have desire to enjoy any of the seeming pleasures of this world, we are only deluding ourselves. The sole purpose and benefit of our understanding the theory of spiritual philosophy is to enable ourselves to develop the true love to experience only our own essential self, which is the one and only absolute reality and the true freedom from any desire to experience anything else. If we really understand that this world, our mind, and everything other than our essential consciousness of being is unreal, we should turn our attention inwards to discover what is real. However, until we actually experience the absolute and infinite reality as our own self, we will continue to experience our finite mind as ourself, and hence we will inevitably experience our mind and everything known by it as real. So long as we experience ourselves to be this mind-body complex, we will continue to experience the world as real. Though for our true inward purpose of discovering the absolute reality, we must develop the understanding and conviction that this world is unreal. For all outward purposes, we must behave as if this world were real, because it is unreal only from the standpoint of the absolute reality and not from the standpoint of our equally unreal mind. Relative to our mind, this world is real, so we must interact with it accordingly. For example, the fact that fire burns may not be the absolute reality, but it is definitely a relative reality. Though we may imagine that we have understood fire to be unreal, if we touch it, we will still feel pain. The fire, our pain, and our mind, which experiences that pain, are all equally real. Therefore, in the non-dualistic philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, an important distinction is always made between absolute reality and relative reality, which in Sanskrit are called respectively Paramartika Satya and Vyavaharika Satya. The word Satya means truth or reality, and the word Paramartika is an adjectival form of Paramartha, which in this context means the ultimate substance or essence. Thus, the term Paramartika Satya, which is usually translated as the supreme reality or absolute reality, literally means the reality that is the ultimate substance or essence of all things. The word Vyavaharika is an adjectival form of Vyavahara, which means doing, action, practice, conduct, behavior, occupation, activity, or any worldly interaction such as business, trade, commerce, or litigation. And thus Vyavacharika Satya means mundane, practical, interactive reality. Hence, in Advaita Vedanta, the term Vyavaharika Satya is used to denote the relative reality of our mind and all that it experiences, while the term Paramartika Satya is used to denote the absolute reality of our essential being. In addition to these two quite distinct forms of reality, some scholars like to distinguish a third form of reality called Pratibhasika Satya. The word Pratibhasika is an adjectival form of Pratibhasa, which means an appearance, a semblance, or an illusion, and thus Pratibhasika Satya means seeming reality, or illusory reality. In certain philosophical texts of Vedanta, the world that we experience in the waking state is described as Vyavacharika Satya, or practical reality, whereas the world that we experience in dream is described as Pratibhasika Satya, or seeming reality. However, the same texts also say that certain things that we experience in the waking state, such as a mirage or the illusion of a snake and a rope, are not Vyavaharika Satya, but only Pratibhasika Satya. Thus, the distinction that is supposed to exist between Vyavacharika Satya and Pratibhasika Satya is that the former is a reality experienced objectively by many people, whereas the latter is a reality experienced subjectively by just one person. However, this distinction is false, and it appears to be true only in relation to our present experience in this waking world. Just as we now imagine that this waking world is experienced objectively by many people, so in dream, we imagine that the dream world was experienced objectively by many people. In both states, however, the many people exist only as images in our own mind. All forms of relative reality or Vyavaharika Satya are in fact only an illusion, a seeming reality or Pratibhasika Satya, and conversely all forms of seeming reality are real relative to the mind that experiences them. Therefore, though the distinction between Vyavaharika Satya and Pratibhasika Satya may appear to be true from a mundane standpoint, from a strictly philosophical standpoint, both these terms denote the same form of reality, the relative but illusory reality experienced by our mind. Basically, there are just two forms of reality: absolute reality and relative reality. Everything that we experience is either absolutely real or only relatively real. Since there can truly be only one absolute reality, everything else is only a form of relative reality. Though we may be able to distinguish different forms of relative reality, such as distinctions are of no use to us if our aim is to experience the absolute reality. We distinguish relative reality from absolute reality only because in order to experience the absolute reality, we must learn to ignore everything that is not absolutely real, and to focus our attention only on that which is absolutely real. However, when we do actually experience the absolute reality as it is, we will discover that it alone exists and that there is nothing other than it. In that state, all relative reality will have merged and disappeared, being found to be nothing other than the one infinite, undivided, and non-dual absolute reality. Some scholastic philosophers describe absolute reality and relative reality as being different levels or planes of reality. However, absolute reality and relative reality cannot be compared in this manner. The absolute reality is absolutely real, so it is relative to nothing, and therefore cannot be compared in any way to anything else. However, from the limited and distorted perspective of relative reality, we have to say that the absolute reality is the ultimate foundation, substratum, or support of all this relative reality. Therefore, though the absolute reality is not related in any way to relative reality is intimately, intrinsically, and unavoidably related to the absolute reality, because it is entirely dependent upon it. That is, all relativity depends for its own seeming reality upon the true reality of the one absolute essence, which is our own self-conscious being or emness, whereas this absolute essence does not depend upon anything else. The concept of such a one-way relationship would be meaningless and self-contradictory if it were formed with respect to anything other than this relationship between the absolute reality and the relative reality. However, we cannot explain this particular relationship as being anything other than a one-way relationship. Because of the two partners in this relationship, only the former is truly real, while the latter is a mere apparition, an illusion that exists only in the outlook of our mind, which is itself part of the illusion that it experiences. The concept of levels or planes of reality can therefore be applied only to the various different forms of relative reality. So long as relative reality appears to exist, there may appear to be any number of different levels or planes of such reality. However, since our aim is to transcend all relative reality and to experience only the non-dual absolute reality, we need not concern ourselves with any analysis or discussions about any different levels or planes of reality, because in truth there is only one reality, and we are that. To our minds, which are long accustomed to the idea that the problems of life are complex and difficult to comprehend fully, and that the solutions to those problems are equally complex and obscure, the account of reality given here may appear to be excessively simple and free of obscurity, and as such to be overly simplistic. However, the absolute reality is indeed perfectly simple and free of all obscurity. Complexity and obscurity belongs only to the realm of relativity, and not to the realm of the absolute. That which is absolute is by its very definition perfectly simple and clear. To be absolute, it must be perfectly non-dual, because all duality is, by its very nature, relative. So long as we imagine any form of duality in the reality, that reality is not absolute but only relative. If we consider the countless relative problems of life, they are indeed extremely complex and impossible to comprehend fully or adequately, and the aim of our discussion here is not to pretend otherwise. What we are considering here is not any relative problems, but is only the absolute reality that underlies all relativity, and since it is absolute, that reality must be perfectly simple and free of all obscurity. Since the absolute reality cannot be limited in any way, it must be infinite and undivided, and as such it must be single, non-dual, and free of all complexity. Since it is infinite, nothing can be other than it, so it must be the true and essential being of everything, including ourselves. Therefore, the absolute reality is nothing other than our own essential being, which we always experience as our perfectly simple, self-knowing, and therefore ever clearly self-evident consciousness I am. The absolute reality is as simple and as obvious as that. The root of all the relative problems that we experience in our life is our mind. Our mind, by its power of imagination, creates all duality and relativity, and duality and relativity inevitably give rise to conflict and complexity. The problems of the relative world will persist in one form or other so long as we seek to solve them only by relative means. No relative solution can solve a relative problem perfectly or absolutely. As soon as one relative problem is solved, or appears to be solved, another relative problem pops up. In a relative world, therefore, a problem-free life is inconceivable. Utopia can never be experienced in a world of duality and relativity, but only in a state beyond all duality and relativity, in a state of absolute non-duality. Since all duality and relativity are experienced only within our own mind, if we wish to find a perfect solution to all the relative problems of life, we must look beyond our mind to the absolute reality that underlies its appearance. Our mind is a relative form of consciousness, and as such it is extremely complex and fraught with problems. In fact, our mind thrives on complexity and problems, and it instinctively shies away from a perfectly simple and problem-free state of non-dual self-consciousness. Why? Because in a state of perfectly clear non-dual consciousness, a state of simple and true self-knowledge, our mind cannot survive. Being an illusory phantom, our mind can appear to exist only in the confusion and darkness of the complex duality of its own self-created state of relative consciousness. In the state of perfectly clear non-dual self-consciousness, all that is known is our simple consciousness of our own being I am. In the clarity of such absolute non-dual self-consciousness, therefore, the illusory appearance of the relative object-knowing consciousness called mind, the consciousness that feels not merely I am, but I am knowing this or I am knowing that, will dissolve and disappear.